Welcome to this introduction to the SPS agreement. This is a program that has been covered by the SADC TRF in conjunction with other partners, but also been housed at the University of Zambia in conjunction with the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, and as well as the Zambia Bureau of Standards. So my name is Ongewa Charles Mutongo, and I'll try and take you through the introduction to the SPS agreement. Okay, first things first. The module itself will try and explain the organizational structure, objectives, functions, and principles of the WTO in relation to the SPS agreement. So there is another module on the WTO, but this one is with specific emphasis on how the SPS sits within the framework of the WTO. It also introduces this WTO agreement and how the SPS is integrated in that framework. Finally, we will try and now explain what the SPS agreement is and structure, the key principles, and how we can implement as countries. Okay, so a bit of the WTO will be covered in Unit 1, and then the SPS agreement itself in Unit 2, and then we'll try and look at the principles of the SPS agreement, and then finally the transparency requirements and the procedures that are used. We'll also look at the SPS tools. All right, so what is the WTO? The Trade Organization is an international organization with now about 188 member countries, and this was established in 1995. It's located in Geneva, Switzerland. It's also important to note that it is the only international organization that deals with multilateral rules, international trade between nations, and these are member countries. What's the objective of the WTO? Is to improve the welfare of its people, that is, the member countries, with respect to standard of living, employment, income. And this is done by expanding the production of and the trade in goods and services. There's a small chart they got from the WTO website. It just highlights the regular work that is done at the WTO and how it helps member states to ease the trade tension. You know, the whole essence of the WTO agreement is to try and create a framework in which member countries can trade freely. They can avoid unnecessary obstacles to trade, and this is where these other agreements also sit in to ensure that there is fairness in whatever barriers are put across. Okay, so you have a picture there down there on the screen, and to show you the TBT as well as the SPS measures relating to food safety, animal health, and plant health. Of course, the TBT will be looking at the trade in all products, both industrial and agricultural, but this specific to just technical requirements. Okay, so there have been 39,000 notifications for the TBT, or there have been 27,000 notifications for the SPS. Specific trade concerns, you have 662 for TBT and 505 for SPS. Disputes that have been started, we have 56 on the side of the TBT and 49 on the side of the SPS. And finally, the rulings when these disputes have been settled. You have 8 for TBT and 13 for SPS. It just gives you a rough idea of um, the work that has been done by the WTO. And these statistics are from 1995 to 2020, somewhere in November 2020. So they're fairly new statistics. Okay, we want to now try and start doing something on the SPS agreement. What do we want to achieve with this introduction? Well, we introduce the agreement on the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It's the SPS. We explain its structure and scope. We also look at the WT or dispute settlement system and how you can try and navigate through the frameworks by the WTO to address the SPS concerns, and also the list of the basic rights and key concepts included in the SPS agreement. I'll try and see the implementation of the SPS agreement. Okay, the first thing that comes to mind when you look at the SPS is the sovereignty of the nations, that each country has a sovereign right to protect its territory. Okay, in the territory, you find things like the population, the people involved. You also find plants, and you also find animals. These can be those that are kept domestic animals or wildlife. But yeah, we have all that sphere that you call the territory. So every government has the right and duty to have some protection over its territory. And in some cases, we have seen that some of these things have even led to war because of the infringement of the constituents of the territory. So the SPS agreement starts with that fact that all governments, all countries have their own rights and duties, of course, to establish appropriate measures to protect animal, human, and plant life and health. But within that framework of the declaration, you have the fact that, or a conditionality, if I may put it that way, that these measures you put to protect your humans, your animals, or your plants should be non-discriminatory and unnecessary. Should not be trade restrictive. They should be based on sound science and internationally agreed risk assessment procedures. In the absence of this condition, then concerns may be raised to say, I think the application of SPS measures is not being done in good faith by country A, and that can be a concern raised by country B. Okay, so we look at it from this scenario. Every country has a right to ensure that the consumers, in this case the citizens, are importing food that is safe for them, importing food that is safe for their animals, food or feed or other nutritional substances that are fit for the plants. Yet how do we determine the level of safety? What is the criteria to use to say this is the safe level of material that can be contained in this commodity that we consume? Therein now lies the whole concept behind the SPS, because in the absence of an acceptable criteria to say this is safe for us to consume, this is safe for us to import, then you leave a bit of uncertainty around the way these trade these trade transactions are happening because somebody comes and says, "Oh, we don't want this sugar; it's very high in this pesticide residue." Uh, so, what informs the decision to say we will only accept the pesticide residue at this stage? So that is what you get in the SPS agreement. So now the agreement itself says or gives guidelines on how you need to proceed with that intention set forth that you want to have a risk that is acceptable, okay, acceptable risk in terms of the safety concerns in a particular food commodity. But how do you ensure that this level of safety is acceptable or is appropriate and is backed by, for example, the scientific community? Okay, so you will see that in all that we will do, we will try and look at the scope of the SPS agreement and try and move within that direction. Okay, the SPS agreement has a twofold objective. Now, we're just trying to amplify this point that the first one is that every country that is a member of the WTO has a sovereign right to provide some level of protection, some level that is deemed by themselves to be appropriate. Okay, but the other objective is to ensure that these SPS measures that you're applying with the intent of protecting your territory with regards to human, animal, and plant health and life do not present unnecessary or arbitrarily, scientifically unjustifiable restrictions. Okay. These usually, when not applying very well, the SPS measures, they kind of become a disguised tool by governments to protect their producers or manufacturers. So they'll say, we don't want this level of the bacteria in milk, and yet maybe there is no justification, scientific justification towards that. So it can be used as a tool to protect the small growing industry, maybe for the dairy, and yet there's no science that really speaks to why are you refusing to get this consignment. So that is how governments sometimes can issue bans or arbitrary measures in terms of limits on commodities, just to avoid trading trading in a commodity with a country that may have be technologically advanced in terms of production advantages. So maybe you may have to compete to be able to compete with the volumes that maybe country B will produce, and so you try and chip in some scientific restriction, and yet that scientific restriction is not recognized by the international scientific community. Okay, I think we've mentioned that the basic principle of the SPS is that a country has a right to protect itself. We should not forget that opening principle, opening framework on which the SPS sits, that every country has that sovereign right to protect itself. Okay, so in terms of the institutional scope, we have a wide range of bodies and systems: central government bodies, local government bodies, which include provincial and state government bodies, regional and non-regional government, and I mean regional and non-governmental bodies, and these may vary according to the type of the body. In terms of scope, you have the measures in the legal force regardless of the date enacted by the WTO member. So what's an SPS measure? We've talked about the SPS agreement. So it's an agreement of the SPS measures. But what is an SPS measure? Well, it's anything that you do to protect the animal, plant life, or health from the risk that may arise from the entry, establishment, spread of pests or diseases, or even disease-carrying organisms or disease-causing organisms. So you can see that it really covers a lot in that aspect. It can handle the disease itself, it can handle the disease-carrying organism itself, or the disease-causing organism. And you can have measures in that regard. You also talk about any measure to protect human life or animal life or health from any risk arising from additives, contaminants, toxins, and disease-causing organisms in the foods or beverages or feedstuff. You see that it also covers what we give to the animals that produce food producing animals given feed. Now, there can be an overlap here. You can have a plant that is edible, so there will be a check on whether that plant carries any pests. But there will also be a check on whether that plant itself has got in it any toxins that may cause health harm to the consumers in the country. The third definition of an SPS measure is anything that you do to protect human life or health from the risk arising from diseases carried by animals, plants, or products thereof. And we are talking about the entry, establishment, and the spread of these pests. So the first one talks about the disease-carrying animals or plants being safeguarded or being stopped from spreading to other animals or plants. And the other aspect is these disease-carrying animals or plants may actually cause diseases to the human life. So there's another aspect there. And finally, you want to prevent or limit other damage within the territory of the member from entry or establishment. The structure of the SPS agreement, you have the provisions highlighted in these articles. So I'll just give you an overview of how the structures are. The structure is laid out and how these articles sit in there. Article 1, we have the general provisions of the agreement. Article 2, we'll talk about the basic rights and obligations. Third one is harmonization, equivalence. With the fourth one, assessment of risk and determination of the appropriate level of sanitary and phytosanitary protection. Adaptation to regional conditions, disease-free areas, areas of low pests, disease preferences. You have Article 7 on transparency, Article 8 on control, inspection, and approval procedures, Article 9, technical assistance, 10, special and differential treatment, consultations and dispute settlement, administration, implementation, the final provisions, and then thereafter, you have the annexes: Annex 1, Annex B, A, B, and C, definitions, transparency, and control, respectively. We will not dwell so much into each article. For the purpose of this program, we decided to spend a lot more time on the harmonization, that is article number 3, and then the scientific evidence or risk assessment, which is your article number 5, and finally article 7, transparency. There is no justification to this highlight, but it's just meant to really drive a point within this space of the training delivery period. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other articles are not to be disregarded. So they are all equally important, but for the purpose of this framework, this training, we have tried to just spend a little bit more time on the others. As you may be aware, the SPS agreement is a legal text, and so what it means is that everything that is described in there is binding. But I think for the purpose of what we're trying to drive at and to achieve in this risk analysis capacity building is to just highlight those 3 and see how they speak to what we want to drive a point at. Okay, so we will look at now the non-discrimination, which is contained in your Article 2. And like I said, we'll be skipping some of these articles and go straight to those that may be of real importance to us. So member countries imposing SPS measures should not make arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between the members, and this should not constitute a disguised restriction. There's always a question as to whether is this protection or protectionism, and yeah, you can go ahead and spend a lot of time in that debate, but the difference can be really minimal sometimes. Okay, harmonization. We're trying to promote trade through harmonizing SPS measures. What we are trying to say through this clause is, let not the dispute come as a result of having used different standards. Let the disputes come as a result of the actual figures being obtained, and you're probably quarreling on or debating on whether this is acceptable level of risk in the context of your local risk assessment, because as you know, that the environment where we live in has a big role to play in how we interact with some of these hazards we face. So the right of the members to choose their own level of protection. When we say that you want to reduce these differing standards, we're trying to say that can we have ways of having international standard setting bodies that can give guidance on how to undertake some form of assessment or determination. And once we use the same procedure, then we should ideally arrive at the same answer. And then maybe that could be the talking point. Okay, so we have this the so-called the 3 sisters of the WTO. They are the standard setting organizations that are recognized in the SPS agreement. For food safety issues, okay, food safety issues, I think we briefly touched on that. We talked about issues of toxins, additives, or even disease-causing agents being found in the food. Um, so who sets guidance? Who sets standards for that? You will find that with the Codex Alimentarius Commission. This is a body that is jointly owned by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, and also the World Health Organization. When it comes to animal health, issues to do with animal health, then you have the OIE, setting standards for the same. For the plant health, you have the BBC. Okay, so we just want to just talk a little bit about this systems, the three systems. In terms of organization form, they are the two of them, first, the Codex and the OIE, are intergovernmental. Or the IPCC is just basically multilateral, but it's administered in the FAO. The members, you have governments under the Codex and governments also under the OIE. But for the IPCC, you can have both governments and non-members of the FAO. The number of members, currently now we have 188 governments for the Codex, 176, over 176 for the OIE, and the 117 contracted parties for the IPCC. In terms of standards, you have the Codex will give you about 224 commodity-based standards with about 79 guidelines, 55 codes of practice, and over 3,000 pesticide residues and a lot more veterinary drug residues. For the OIE, you have terrestrial and aquatic animal health codes. And these are really huge documents that look at the value chain approach towards the treatment, the protection of animals. Codex Alimentarius Commission is a joint FAO and WHO Food Standards Program. This one was created in 1963 to help develop standards, guidelines, and codes of practice with particular bias towards food safety. The purpose of the Codex Alimentarius Commission is to protect health of consumers and ensure fair, tradable practices in the food trade, and to promote coordination and coordination of all food standards by these international government and non-governmental organizations. Okay, the multilateral treaty for international cooperation in plant protection. It's a global instrument for harmonizing of all phytosanitary nations. It's a sanitary standard setting body that is named in the SPS agreement. So the SPS has tried to address the issue of harmonization by identifying the standard setting bodies that can be used to generate either standards or guidelines or even codes of practices in order to avoid the ambiguity of getting different results simply because different procedures have been used. So the IPPC will try, the purpose is to try and secure a common and effective action to prevent the spread and introduction of pests of plants and plant products, and to promote appropriate measures for their control. Okay, the third principle of the SPS agreement is equivalence. In the SPS agreement, the agreement itself recognizes that more than one SPS measure may be equally effective in satisfying a country's appropriate level of protection. The burden of proof in this case is on the exporting country. If the exporting member objectively demonstrates that it is that its measures achieve the allowable level of protection, then the members shall accept what the measures being taken by the other member. Scientific evidence. In terms of food safety, animal and plant health, there is an underlying principle that these should take precedence over all trade. If there is a risk to animals, there's a risk to plants, and there's a risk to the human consumers, that should be considered first before the trade can be sanctioned. What that means is that you need to have demonstrable scientific basis for the safety and health requirements. Okay? The agreement does not disagree with the nations that want to receive safe products or safe animals or safe plants. But what it's saying is that there has to be provision for a demonstrable scientific basis for those requirements. Article 5.1 of the SPS agreement, like you've been informed, that we'll try and delve in a little bit more in the scientific evidence, the article on scientific evidence, because it is very unique to the spirit of this training session. So Article 5.1 requires that the SPS measures be based on an assessment of risk to human, animal, plant life, or health. The beauty about this risk assessment is that it's not arbitrary. You have guidance or guidelines given by the three sisters that we mentioned earlier on, the OIE, the IPPC, and the Codex Alimentarius Commission. They give guidelines on how to undertake these risk assessments, so that in you setting up requirements with regard to the right to protect your humans, animal, or plant life and health, you undertake the risk assessments as guided by those three bodies. What more can we say? That the importing countries can also rely on the assessments made by another country if it is appropriate. It's an appropriate risk assessment. So you do not have to conduct your own risk assessment in order to verify that the products you are receiving are safe. You can also read out the risk assessment done by the exporting countries, for as long as, of course, you agree that the appropriate risk assessment has been done. It is adequate, it is suitable. And that is what the SPS is trying to encourage. With regard to disease or pest risk, the article continues to say, evaluation of the likelihood of entry, establishment, spread of a pest or disease should be done according to the SPS, which might be applied, and of the associated potential biological and economic consequences. So you are looking at the pest or disease of interest, and then you assess the likelihood of maybe entry, establishment, and spread. And once you've done that, then you want to now bring all that in the light of what would be the impact if everything like that happened. It's an issue of risk. What's the likelihood? What's the severity? The severity in this case has to consider the biological or the economic consequences. For food safety, you also do the potential for adverse effects on the human or animal health that can arise from the use of additives, contaminants, toxins found in these foods, or even some microbials, in this case, the big ones, the disease causing organisms, or even just the bacteria and the viruses that, have, that have been packaged in these foodstuffs. The article also under 5 for the scientific evidence also recognizes what is called the precautionary measures or the precautionary principles. Um, this is something that gives the right to authorities to say, in the absence of a detailed study about the risk, we have information about the hazard and of course, the characterization of the hazard. It can do this amount of harm and damage if allowed in our territory. So without a full detailed risk analysis, so to say, they can do a small assessment that can allow them to say, even if we do not have information yet to establish the real probability of getting this harm to health, plants, or animals, we will still impose SPS measures. The countries can, to some extent, of course, apply the precautionary principle. It's a safety approach, but you're only trying to deal with scientific uncertainty. If the uncertainty is high, the authority with which you apply your measures is compromised. So you want to reduce the uncertainty to as low as possible. But if you do not have a lot of scientific information, you can still forego that huge scientific uncertainty and move on to apply your SPS measures. But the common elements of the precautionary principle have got to be followed. Okay, that there is a possibility or plausible threats of harm. Yes, we know this can actually harm. It is known as a known fact. It can harm. The lack of scientific certainty, we should be able to, in our assessment, agree that the uncertainty around this discussion with regards to the risk of being harmed is still huge. It's a huge uncertainty, or the certainty is low, or maybe not even there. And finally, that these actions are only based on the ideal of just trying to prevent the harm. That we may not know the other information, we may not be able to determine how this the exposures and determine the consequences. But we know potentially that this thing is very harmful, so we can apply the measures right there and then. So a risk analysis can be made using just very little information, with a clear understanding that the uncertainty is too high. And sometimes uncertainty can be because maybe the different scientific communities are not agreeing on a particular topic. Okay, so the measures to compensate for the uncertainty can be allowed, but the professional measures without a risk assessment are not um, permissible. So, what will be done is just a small assessment, but it should not be arbitrary. Say, okay, there's this in there, and so we don't want it. We need to do some assessment of some kind, even in the midst of a huge uncertainty from the science point. Okay, so members may provisionally adopt the SPS measures when the relevant scientific information is insufficient on the basis of available information. And usually, these precautionary measures are not cast for a long time. You want to review and check if there's any available information that has come to the fore, and you want to again just reassess your position. Okay. In such circumstances, as a concluding remark, that the members shall seek to obtain additional information to assess the risk, to also review the measures within a reasonable period of time. So, like I said, you will not, because of the huge uncertainty, you will want to have some reasonable time frame through which you can revisit the measures and try and see if there's any new development in terms of information and stuff like that. Okay, so we will end our presentation for today and continue from the principles of the SPS agreement that is now Article 5. What are we going to discuss? It's basically the appropriate level of protection that you can apply as a member country.